I'm Paul Saunders. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest, and we're grateful to all of you for coming out on a summer Friday afternoon for the discussion. I think it will be hopefully an interesting and provocative one. We are at the Center co-sponsoring this meeting today with the Energy Innovation Reform Project, and Sam Thernstrom, who's the Executive Director, is here. I'll introduce him at somewhat greater length in a couple of minutes, but we're very pleased to work together with the EIRP to do this. I won't give a long substantive introduction of the topic. I think the topic is a fairly straightforward one. We have seen the Obama administration kind of challenged in moving its climate agenda forward through the Congress and turning to some other approaches to try to do that. And we want to have a conversation today about how successful that's been, how successful it's likely to be. We'll fold in also some of the international issues and hopefully have a very good discussion. So I'll introduce briefly our three speakers. To my left is Jeff Hopkins, who's the Vice President for Policy and Analysis at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Jeff has, Dr. Hopkins, I should say, has extensive experience in the public sector, in the private sector, the acting chief economist for the House Budget Committee, also worked at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, and has worked in the private sector, including for 7 years at Rio Tinto, the big natural resources and mining firm, working on climate policy issues, and has a PhD from Ohio State. Our second speaker, who's on my immediate right, is Dr. Vaughan Turekian, who is the Chief International Officer at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, was a AAAS fellow and then a special assistant, not senior advisor, special assistant to the Undersecretary of Global Affairs in the Department of State during the Bush administration, and prior to that directed a major assessment of the science of climate change for the National Academy of Sciences, and has a PhD in atmospheric geochemistry, right? And then to my furthest right is Sam Thernstrom, who I mentioned earlier, who is Executive Director of the Energy Innovation Reform Project, a senior fellow here at the Center, and in the past has been variously a speechwriter for former New York Governor George Pataki, the communications director of the White House Council on Environmental Quality during the George W. Bush administration, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a senior climate policy advisor for the Clean Air Task Force, among other things, I'm sure. So thank you very much to the three of you for being with us today. We will start with Jeff Hopkins. Each of our panelists will speak for not more than 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So, Jeff, please.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and delighted to be here on the panel, and I'd like to wish everybody a happy Friday. Let the record show it's beautiful out. So thank you for coming and spending time with us. Hopefully we've contributed maybe in your exit strategy out of the office by the end of the day. I wouldn't blame anybody for that. I'll tell you a little bit about the organization I work for, Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. It's a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank, started in 1998. as the Pew Center for Global Climate Change, changed its name a couple of years ago, and kind of have three main areas where we try to make strong contributions in energy and climate policy. The first one is we either write or commission studies on important energy and climate topics. One that we developed ourselves just within the past few months was a study on nuclear power and the impacts from the unanticipated loss of about 5 nuclear power plants within the past year or so, and the impacts of the loss of those nuclear power plants for meeting our emissions goals. Another study that we commissioned with researchers from Brookings and from American Enterprise Institute was a study on carbon tax and the implications of carbon tax approach, and also kind of options that states might have under 111D for putting a price on carbon. We write papers, we convene groups. In fact, the way I got to know fellow panelist Sam was through a group that we convene along with the Great Plains Institute called the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative. This is a group that is pursuing increasing the opportunities and policies that would allow for more carbon capture and storage with enhanced oil recovery. A very important technology if we're going to reduce GHGs globally. That's another thing that C2ES does, is convene groups. NAORI, the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative, is probably the only thing that we're really doing lobbying Congress right now. We used to do a lot more political outreach, but increasingly there's little appetite to take action. How do you do it unless people have an appetite for the conversation? Third thing that C2ES does is convene a group called the Business Environment Leadership Council, and that's a group of about 30 mostly international Fortune 100 companies, and that's how I got to know C2ES, because for 7 years Rio Tinto was on the BELC, or Business Environment Leadership Council, and I found that C2ES was always willing to take tough looks at important issues. And I know from private sector positioning that you need to have people looking at issues seriously. I felt that C2ES was a leader in that, so when I joined only about 6 months ago, I've just been delighted with opportunities to engage on this. So my background is mostly an economist, as an economist, and it's in economics and resource economics, and I tended to bring that lens to all the different positions I had. Most economists are worried in some form or another about sustainability, although they may not call it that. They're concerned about sustainability of solutions, sustainability of institutions, sustainability of business models and business strategies, and they're always looking for a policy position that can be sustained over time. Even better if it can be sustained at kind of a supranational national level. And I think that's why companies like Rio Tinto and companies that are also members of our Business Environment Leadership Council are always looking to engage on the issue of climate change, and always looking to try to support initiatives that collectively address what is a global problem. So moving on to the President's Climate Action Plan, essentially what they're taking up is a 17% reduction from 2005 levels by 2020. So whereas the pledge was made in a period of time where you actually had some movement in Congress and something that they took the number from to begin with, the 17% reduction, and that support for that has largely fallen away in Congress, if it was ever there. The administration has not run from that 17% number. They've continued to use it. So the Climate Action Plan, and in particular, the EPA rule for the existing power plant rule, is largely meant to close the gap between where we are today, and where we are today is a little bit around halfway to that 17% reduction goal. But if you look at the forecast of where we're going between now and 2020 using business as usual, even though we've gotten about 10, 11, 12% towards that 17% goal, we're forecast to give at least a couple percentage points away just under business as usual growth. So it's necessary if we're going to meet that goal, and we think that goal is very worthy to meet, to put in place a new sort of plan, do something about existing power plants. So I think about it in that context. The proposal that the President has put forward on existing power plants is not going to close that gap by 2020. It looks like it's not going to make it all by itself. That's not the only component of the Climate Action Plan, but it's probably the biggest. So we just definitely think that it's necessary. I don't know if it's useful. Maybe in the comments, Q&A, we can talk about the approach in the existing power plant rule. A lot of people have heard there are 4 pillars. I won't get into what those are, 4 building blocks. I won't get into what those are. I'm happy to in the Q&A. But I would say that it's a very bottom-up approach. And I think when you go with a bottom-up approach that's based on where states are headed, where the power sector finds itself today, and go from there, I think it's more workable. I think it's more sustainable. I'm not saying that this approach is perfect and that it's perfectly sustainable, but all these sort of assessments need to be made in a compared to what. You need to ask that question, compared to what. And I think if compared to what is business as usual, where we're giving ground away relative to what we've achieved in the past several years, that's not to be desired. In contrast, what we need to do is work towards that goal and go past it. So, like I said, happy to talk about the components of the power plant rule, and we've done a lot of research on it, and we'll continue to develop our own thoughts. And I'm very interested in your own.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Let me turn it over to Vaughan, who will look a little bit more at the international level.
Okay, so how many people here think that we are closer today to a binding international agreement than we were 6 years ago? How many people here are awake? Noted. How many people think we are further from a binding international agreement than we were 6 years ago? How many people believe that we were never going to get a binding international agreement? You had your hand up twice. And so where I come from is actually that position, that a binding international agreement that was going to cut greenhouse gas emissions was not in the cards, whether you're talking 1997, 2007, or as we move forward to 2017. My second argument is going to be that really for this administration, the pressure is off on that. And the pressure is off for a number of reasons. So let's go back just to give a little bit of, and people in this room know better than I do, the historical context. I was involved in some of it. But coming into after the 2008 election, and actually even during the 2008 election, obviously the president, or then candidate Obama, was very actively pursuing a global climate change strategy. I think many remember his big speech in Berlin, which, no matter what the rhetoric was, the basis of it was, or some elements of it was, that we are going to work together in a global community to stop global change, or climate change. And then again, that was something that was reiterated during his victory speech in Chicago in 2009. A lot of events probably changed even the way that the administration views the reality of that situation. First was very early on, when the president went to Copenhagen during one of the early COPs, and I think probably believed and had some maybe original reason to believe that that was going to lead, a head of state visit was going to push forward what had really been a stalled process through the United Nations Framework Convention. That putting such high level and political capital on the line was going to actually alter the way that the global community was going to come together around climate change. In fact, I think people that look at that from a distance see that that was a very difficult set of negotiations, where you had a changing balance even within the community of the global climate change community, not least of which was the fact that the Europeans were marginalized during the discussion, and they had up to that point been the key drivers for climate change policy at a global level. So you have the end of the sort of that meeting in Copenhagen, and then moving forward to the fact that you're still dealing with, at a global scale, an economic crisis which was continuing to go forward. And so the appetite for major regulatory transformation around climate change and greenhouse gases was actually not really even there at that time. You also had domestically a decision that was made during a period when the administration had, in the 2009-2010 period, had complete control of Congress, a decision to go really with one major piece of legislation. And that decision on major piece of legislation, as we know, focused on health care and not cap and trade. And probably pragmatically, even though it doesn't necessarily seem like it, healthcare was probably easier than actually cap and trade would have been, probably coming out of the Senate for lots of reasons. Then so you have the economic problems. Then you actually have something else that happens, and I think we shouldn't underestimate this. Fukushima changed the nature in which a lot of people even thought about nuclear power. And when you look at what's happening in Japan and now what's happening here, so how many people have driven down to the Outer Banks this summer, or down to the Eastern Shore past Virginia Beach? Okay, you're really on the ball today. You're gonna and seeing the huge coal piles sitting there in Chesapeake, Virginia. Do you know what the #1 importer of American coal was 2 years ago? Which? Europe. The #1 importer of American coal. The nature of the energy balance during a period of economic problems, so energy and economy decoupling, means that really that you're seeing the transformation of, or the use of coal as a major component of the European energy system. And then you have thrown upon that Fukushima and the movement, particularly by the Greens, away from any nuclear. And not only the shutting down of nuclear, but the ending of nuclear. And that's a major implication. You talk to people in France, and they say, people assume that France is going to keep nuclear for the foreseeable future. You are a few elections away from nuclear actually not being the French right of energy for lots of things. So you have that. You have the continuing economic problems in Europe, which again are changing the nature to which Europe is focusing on climate change, and for a long period they had been really the moral voice in the global climate negotiations around needing binding treaties. And then you have China, and the increase in Chinese surpassing the United States, which actually happened during the last administration, in the greenhouse gas emissions. So even the change in the responsibility for climate change in a much more obvious way, that China was now viewed not only as equal to the U.S. in terms of emissions, but in the future trajectories, the really important country to begin to address with. And then on top of that, you have, in the U.S., a transformation to gas. And that transformation to gas was happening well before policies were put in place. away from coal, they were actually the changes in some of the technology and even the recognition from some of the economic motivators around the function of gas. And that had big implications, because what that does is it already begins to move some of the greenhouse gas emission data, along with the economic recession in 2008, towards a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. All of this is to say the pressure comes off of the administration internationally. And there are implications for that. Now, there are ways in which the administration is working internationally, and I think if you look at what happened in China, there continues to be a focus on engaging China on a number of different things, but climate change does seem to be a place where there are at least some dialogue taking place, particularly around some of the technologies that are coming out. Another area where I think we should realize is that you cannot decouple the domestic politics. So when somebody asks, do I think that there will be a binding international treaty on climate change, the reason why I keep the same answer as I kept 10 years ago, and maybe even more now, is to have a binding international treaty on climate change, you have to get 67 votes in the U.S. Senate. I mean, naming apple pie as a really good dessert won't get 67 votes in the U.S. Senate. Climate change is going to be even a harder thing. So even if you have a domestic policy which has some domestic consensus, and you even came out, so even arguing that if you had 60 votes out of the Congress in 2009, or out of the Senate in 2009, you still weren't going to get 67 votes to get a binding treaty out of the United States. And without the United States, you're not going to get a binding international treaty that's going to be meaningful. So I realize that my time is up, but at the end of the day, I say my two messages are, the pressure really is off the administration on the international treaty piece for lots of reasons taking place outside the United States. And so what they're pursuing domestically and what they're pursuing internationally are going to be, as discussed here, domestically, but also internationally, I think a little bit more, I'd say, pragmatic, because that's where that's going to have to go, and the future administrations as well. And we are no closer and we are no further from a binding international climate change treaty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vaughan. Sam.
Oh, sorry, Senator.
Thank you, Paul.
And there are a couple of seats up here at the table, by the way, for anybody who is sitting on the side, if any of you would like to move up here.
So I'm just going to try to make three big picture points. I'm going to focus more back on the domestic side than Vaughan's remarks. And the 3 points I want to leave you with today would be that I do think that we should be acting on climate. I think climate is a serious strategic risk to the United States and to the global interests, but that we also need to be pragmatic about climate and understand the strategic implications of different climate policies. I think that the Obama administration's regulatory approach is locking in failure on climate policy just at the time when we should be reaching for success, and I think that's a serious concern, and I'll explain my thinking there. And to speak to the question that I think Jeff quite correctly raised of compared to what, I think the answer to that is that there is an innovation first approach to climate policy that could potentially be much more successful than the regulatory approach if we could follow it. So to unpack those basic points, I think it's very important that we take climate risks seriously, but that we understand them in a pragmatic perspective. The nature of the climate challenge, I think, is quite different from conventional air pollutants, where incremental reductions down below a threshold where you have health effects has been the goal. And so identifying a relatively small set of emission sources, industrial sources of pollution, and installing known technologies on them based upon a cost-benefit analysis to reduce emissions to a level where you have health benefits, that's a fairly proven and accepted approach to it, which obviously has been contentious, but nevertheless I think has worked reasonably well over the years. I think the climate challenge is very, very different particularly because, well, two factors. One, the extraordinary abundance of CO2 that it is produced by every aspect of the global economy, including myself as I sit here and breathe and talk, and each one of you. But also, secondly, and more uniquely, the extraordinary persistence of CO2 means that CO2 emissions are cumulative. Essentially, for our meaningful perspective, once you put it up there, CO2 is more or less not coming down, not within our lifetimes. And so the question of how to deal with climate change involves not simply reducing emissions below a threshold at which there are clear health effects. The real challenge is to get to global zero or something very close to that. And what the time frame for that would be, of course, is debated, but the ultimate target, I think, is very clear. And the challenge is that you not only have to figure out how to decarbonize the existing global energy system, but you have to do it at the same time that we're building an energy system that is twice or even 3 times as large as the one we have today. Now, a lot of my conservative friends look at those facts and think, well, America has no ability to act unilaterally in that regard. This is a global problem, not a national problem. As Vaughan says, we're unlikely to reach a binding global treaty, and so the answer is that therefore we should do nothing because we are powerless. And I actually disagree with that line of thinking. I think America does have an opportunity to act unilaterally on climate in a way that would be effective, but it only really involves one lever, which I don't think is being sufficiently pressed these days, and that lever is innovation. And to me, the core of the climate challenge is that the price and performance of clean energy technologies today are nowhere close to being competitive with carbon-intensive forms of energy. And the day that we can address that effectively by innovating in clean energy technologies and making them, if not perfectly price and performance competitive, at least much, much closer than they are today, we'll have solved the problem on a global scale. And until we do that, we really won't solve the problem. And so the question is, what can we do to make clean energy cheap? And I think the problem we have with existing policy is that most efforts are focused on making dirty energy expensive, which I think is a politically divisive and ultimately unsuccessful path. And so what America could do unilaterally is to focus on the innovation challenge in clean energy technologies. How do we do a technology push would be the term that people prefer on this. And that I think that is the real path, both to harmonizing the values that people have found most divisive around this space, but also to actually getting us to zero emissions. The question of the EPA regulatory approach, which is obviously a hot topic of concern in town today, I think deserves a little bit of discussion here. Obviously the President has gotten a lot of praise from environmental groups for his leadership on this issue. They've been waiting a long time for some kind of federal action on carbon, and I support federal action on carbon. I think it's important that we have a national policy on carbon. But I do think that people should be mindful of the dangers of locking in one path on policy and of the kind of partisan groupthink that comes together around an identified path. So I personally have always argued that Vice President Gore's decision to sign the Kyoto Protocol was a disastrous mistake because Kyoto Protocol became the focus of all the international efforts around climate, despite the fact that obviously the Byrd-Hagel resolution had passed 95-0 before Vice President Gore signed the Kyoto Protocol. That was dead on arrival the day he inked it, and yet in signing the protocol, that became the policy for international efforts on climate, when in fact if we had not signed the Kyoto Protocol, people would have kept working on the challenge. And in that same vein, when I worked for President Bush, I said, without persuading many people, I think, that I think President Bush did the world a favor in saying what was obviously the case, that America wasn't going to sign the Kyoto Protocol and that we should be thinking about other options. And in that same vein, I look at the EPA regulatory approach, and rather than seeing a path to decarbonization, I see something that locks in very modest incremental emissions reductions at best, while not setting a path to zero. The actual technology forcing effects of the EPA regulatory approach are going to be quite modest. We will basically, for the next 15 years at least, do little other than fuel shifting to burn more natural gas. That produces a very satisfying appearance of progress. It continues the trend that we have now, that the President is already benefiting from, but it isn't a path to zero emissions. And so my question is, if we're thinking about carbon seriously, what is the path to zero emissions? And I'll get to my thoughts on that in just a moment. I think just one other point, though, really needs to be emphasized about the EPA approach, which is that EPA has really gone very far out on a legal limb with their approach to this. And because it's a very complicated rule and because there's a lot of partisan feelings about it, I don't think this message has been clear enough in the public discourse that the term of art is beyond the fence line. And the point is that traditionally the understanding of EPA's authority with the Clean Air Act has been that the Clean Air Act gives EPA the authority to regulate what happens to smokestacks and what happens with the way we burn petroleum in cars and trucks in this country. And that's it. Smokestacks and petroleum. And the heart of the EPA regulatory proposal is all beyond that scope, beyond the fence line. So EPA is in effect asserting itself as the authority to determine the mix of generation that our electricity comes from, the fuel sources that different states use. And to achieve that, they actually need to, particularly in some areas such as energy efficiency, are asserting the authority to control entities in the state level that they've never had the authority to address before, such as state public benefit corporations that have the ability to push energy efficiency measures into the states. And so I'm very concerned that because of this kind of natural circling of the wagons and coming together around the administration's approach, the focus of all environmental activity around carbon these days will be supporting a regulatory approach that I think has very grave legal challenges and is likely to be sent back to the drawing board. And so we're putting all of our efforts into something that I think is likely to not actually pay off, and that even if it did pay off, even if it avoids legal challenges and avoids congressional challenges, the result will be only very modest emissions reductions. And so again, I go back to the question of what is our strategic perspective on climate. If the goal is how do you get to zero global emissions, I think burning more natural gas in America doesn't really do much for us. And so to take up Jeff's question of compared to what, I think the answer is that there is a real opportunity to take an innovation-centered approach to climate that could potentially get us to much deeper emissions reductions over the long run. And this is where Jeff alluded to some of the work that we've done together and how we got to know each other. So my perspective is that rather than looking at overall emissions numbers or the annual incremental reductions you might get from a policy, we should be looking at the key technology areas and what is it that we need out of those sectors. And so if you're looking for how you actually get to carbon-free electric generation, I think that there's been a misplaced focus on energy efficiency and renewables because that's what the environmental advocacy community has been strongly supportive of for many years. I think our greatest decarbonization opportunities come from the zero carbon baseload generation opportunities, which I would focus primarily on decarbonized fossil fuels, that is carbon capture and sequestration, and advanced nuclear generation opportunities. And when I look at the EPA regulatory proposal, I see very little in there for carbon capture and sequestration and very little for advanced nuclear. I think nuclear plants will probably benefit a little bit from it. They'll run a little bit more. Maybe some of the plants that would be slated for retirement, well, their lifetime will be extended. But if you're looking to build new nuclear in this country, particularly advanced reactor designs, I don't think the EPA regulations are a push for that at all. And so to just give you some sense of a different way of thinking about it, the NEORI initiative that Jeff mentioned that we worked together on is designed to produce it supports a federal tax credit. It would be a temporary tax credit awarded through reverse auctions, so the amount of credit would be minimized, but it would be a way to underwrite the construction of carbon capture and sequestration on power plants and use the carbon that is captured to enhance the recovery of oil out of existing domestic wells. So as wells are produced, oil wells, so as oil is produced from these wells, pressure in the wells drop and it becomes harder to produce that oil. Carbon dioxide has some unique chemical properties that make it very effective at increasing the pressure in these wells, separating the oil out from the pores in the rock where it's captured, and pushing it out. And so what we have an opportunity to do is to actually drive a very significant amount of carbon capture and sequestration on U.S. electric power fleets on a market basis, potentially as much as 100 gigawatts, which would be roughly half of the coal-fired plants in this country, could have carbon capture installed on a market basis if we had a tax incentive that would close the gap between what oil companies today can pay for carbon and what what it costs coal companies and other industrial providers to capture it and provide it. And so the basic mindset here is 100% different from the regulatory approach. It's think about carbon as a potential tool to produce oil and as a market that would be associated with that, and that would directly change the economics of carbon capture as opposed to the regulatory approach, which many people believe would do little to advance carbon capture and might actually undermine the development of it. I don't want to talk much longer, but just a couple words on advanced nuclear, because I do think that if you care about the climate, that nuclear energy is really indispensable to any realistic program to reach significant global emissions reductions. And I think the key with nuclear is that we need to have the next generation of reactors coming forward and being built, not simply the 1960s technologies that are mostly on the market today. And again, I would just really emphasize that the barriers that I see to the development of advanced nuclear, both in this country and globally today, are not barriers that an EPA regulatory approach to carbon is likely to address. For instance, I'm particularly focused on the fact that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in this country really doesn't have either the mission or the capability to license advanced reactor designs. If we were to give them that mission and give them that capability, there are a lot of designs that are out there on paper that America's finest nuclear entrepreneurs have done a tremendous job in developing, but which we aren't giving them the opportunity to build in this country. And so while I understand that the political impetus to show tangible progress, to set numbers, to have laws that supposedly guarantee outcomes, that's the common political imperative. And so the president's approach is consistent with that. But I think if you're actually looking at what could potentially get us to zero emissions from the U.S. power sector and to providing a technology that potentially could be adopted into global markets, I think a targeted approach on technology advancement would be a lot more effective.
Thanks very much, Sam. Why don't we open it up for questions, comments, and discussion? Who'd like to go first? Larissa. And please identify yourself, everyone, before you ask your question or make your comment.
Larissa Dobriansky, General Microgrids. Really great discussion across all of you, but Sam, you've stimulated some questions in me. I never thought, I'll be kind of the here prodder, and as somebody served with the Bush administration, I never thought I'd be framing the questions in this way, but two you stimulated in my mind. First, I've been heavily involved, still to date, in the innovation programs at USDOE. In all fairness, I think you seem to suggest that the Obama administration is putting all eggs in one basket and taking a regulatory approach. This is not what I've observed. How effective, the innovation programs are, that's another question, but I don't think they're putting all eggs in one basket. I think that, this isn't so conducive to translation in campaigns, but there have been significant lessons learned arising from the ARA projects across the entire spectrum. There's a big consensus that what is moving forward in ARPA-E is excellent, and so I don't see that the eggs are all in one basket. But I do see, of course, room for improvement. The question, though, that I'm beginning of an empirical nature is that given the innovation moving at pace, I hate to say this, but what I'm witnessing is that it's more cost effective on the renewable energy and the energy efficiency. And despite the economic crises and all, we're seeing some significant market penetration there. And every time I look at the programs and how they're progressing on the carbon capture and sequestration side in the nuclear, I see a long haul ahead of us in terms of making that cost competitive. And I don't think we should be so targeted that we just choose those over the others. So I think we should have diversification. But I think, in contrast to you, and you can react to all of above that I've said, these are my observations and my objective ones. No ideology here. I've just gone through different programs, and this is what I've been exposed to and have witnessed, and so I'm really interested in your reaction. I think improvement could be made, but of a different nature that you've mentioned. Then a different side of the picture. I think you're exactly right. I think this is going to be a long haul, second different type of question, a long haul on the, couching the EPA rule on 111D. This is, I think, a very controversial proposition, but I find this an exciting one. Again, this may surprise you, this question too, but I find this an exciting one because the way EPA has drawn this all up is an admission that we've got significant deficiencies in these siloed environmental statutes, because they've realized they couldn't just follow the business as usual, imposing, reduction targets on greenhouse gas emission targets on facilities within the base, within the fence line. To have come out with that and coming out of an economic crisis, that would have been dead on arrival. So they've been highly creative, and it's very controversial. I personally think there is going to be a backlash here, but I think it may be for the better to make everybody realize we've got the technologies to take us out of the silos, and these silos themselves are constraining us in terms of our potential to unleash innovation. So those are my two observations.
Well, Sam, let's please let's have your reaction.
Sure, those are some great comments, Larissa, and I appreciate that. I would certainly take your point that the Obama administration has had an approach to energy innovation. Obviously, that was a major focus of the DOE Stimulus Act spending. This is a larger and more complicated topic than I think we could fully unpack here. But as you know, I have very strong differences of opinion with the Obama administration about their approach to innovation. And to just broadly characterize it, I would say they have been trying to drive innovation through a demand pull approach. Their idea being, let's subsidize the construction of 1,000 or thousands and thousands of today's status quo windmills and PV panels, and that demand will pull more innovative technologies into the market. My belief is that we actually haven't seen a lot of that, and in fact we've seen some perverse effects where the PTC really subsidizes the use of status quo clean energy technologies and undercuts the impetus towards better ones, or at least arguably does so. And so I'd like to see what I would call a more tech push approach to innovation, much more focused on the functioning of the R&D programs within the federal government and of the effects that programs like the PTC have on innovation. So you're right, absolutely. The Obama administration cares about innovation. I have a difference of opinion about their approach to innovation. I would also, as I think you probably can anticipate, disagree with you on the renewables picture. Dave Garman, who's sitting, I think, right next to you there, and I have written on this question extensively in the past. I think that really the claims that renewables are cost competitive today are based upon a misleading look at merely the cost of the direct technology. What does it cost to put a solar panel on your roof, and not at the larger cost of integrating and balancing those renewable energy sources within the electrical system. And that if we had true cost accounting for the effect that renewables have, you would see that they are very far from being cost competitive. And I think the proof is in the pudding. The fact that it is widely anticipated that unless the PTC is renewed in tax extenders this year, we're not going to be building windmills in this country next year, and that solar installations are likely to drop significantly as well, suggests that the problem is that these are technologies that really are not able to survive on a market basis. And of course, state renewable portfolio standards have been the main driver of renewables as well. It's not that they are competing on a market basis at all. I agree on CCS. We're a long ways from straight up market competitiveness, but I do think that the opportunity to produce oil while commercializing CCS technologies is a game changer in how we can think about that, and that if we were to have federal support for a limited period of time, a 10-year tax credit, not a permanent tax credit, federal support for EOR could actually dramatically change the competitiveness of CCS technologies and bring the advanced CCS technologies that are kind of just over the horizon into the market. So I am actually quite optimistic about the possibilities that CCS could be made to be practical. Just on the beyond the fence line stuff and the flexibility there, I would say that I think there's an interesting dynamic where I would certainly agree that the fact that EPA has gone beyond the fence line is what allows them to be flexible in the proposed regulations to give states a lot more options, and so potentially it would drive down costs of compliance. But at the same time, I don't think we can afford to overlook the fact that they are way out on a legal limb there, and so I think it's very unlikely that the courts are going to sustain that. EPA is essentially saying we are going to determine what the mix of fuels that are used in electric markets should be in the states. And to do that, we're not only going to command the states to do certain things, but we're going to reach entities that have never been subject to federal direction before.
But it does show the limitations of the Clean Air Act itself.
It does. And so my takeaway from that is that as difficult as it would be, I think there is no way to get the Clean Air Act to effectively address carbon without Congress stepping forward and participating in that process. And how we get there is hard to know, but I don't think that the current regulatory approach is necessarily helping us. I'm sorry if that's kind of a long-winded answer.
Well, it's a long-winded question.
Jeff, Vaughan, do either of you have any reaction to that?
No, I would agree with everything Sam said about pushing innovation. We need to be doing more of that. We need to think about how to do that, and we need to kind of begin to think outside of our traditional sources of energy, such as renewables. There's a whole lot going on in terms of energy storage and other ways of providing energy services to households. It's really booming, and we need to find ways to harness it and support it. So,
Thanks very much. Any other questions, Rich? And we have a mic coming, sorry.
Rich from George Mason University. I take the point about the Europeans not leading on climate change, but are there some things going on in these other areas, carbon capture and innovation in Europe, that we should be paying attention to as well?
I don't want to say that they're not leading on climate change. I think that when you're involved in the negotiations, you see that oftentimes the Europeans took a moral high ground in the international negotiations, and they tended to use that position as a way, from a more public diplomacy way, of pushing, I would say, the public perception that the U.S. was not doing anything, or that the U.S. was being recalcitrant in negotiations. In fact, given a number of the things that have happened over the past 7 years, I think you're not seeing that position as strongly either articulated or as influential in the global negotiations. So the European position is no longer as strong in the international negotiations in terms of, I would say, for the lack of a better word, shaming the United States as it maybe was 8 years ago or 9 years ago. I think you might have a better feel on what's going on in the innovation. I think that they do continue to invest fairly heavily. I think the Germans are quite invested in a lot of the renewable research and development and deployment. But particularly around wind and solar.
Yeah, and I would also say the Europeans certainly are doing some important work on carbon capture and sequestration. I'd like to see these international innovation systems more integrated with what we're doing in America, rather than kind of siloed the way they are.
And one of the big questions is coming up around the policy debate. Is the question about gas. There's a lot of shale gas in Europe. The legal constraints and the political constraints make it really not something that's being pursued. In the U.S., you own the mineral rights on your property. In Europe, you don't, and that has implications for even how the private drilling takes place.
Just a CCS project to keep your eye on is in England. It's called the Peterhead Project. It's going to be carbon capture and storage on natural gas. There's no reason that carbon capture and storage would have to be restricted to coal. Any fossil fuel you could capture the CO2 from. That is not an EOR project, but it is CO2 storage offshore. And this is a project that has had several different evolutions. Shell is behind this project now, and I think there's a lot of potential and good that can come from that will be a great demonstration for use of CCS on gas.
What do you make?
Sorry, if we could get the mic. Sorry.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Suzanne Goldenberg. What do you make of the cost overruns and the other problems that we've seen in the developments at Kemper, which are quite legendary? And how does that then fit in with your thesis that CCS is going to be that CCS is key to moving towards a sort of a decarbonization economy.
And if you can explain what Kemper is for people who may not be familiar.
Sure. So Kemper is a power plant with carbon capture and sequestration that the Southern Company is building in Kemper County, Mississippi, and I actually visited there 2 or 3 months ago and got to see the plant firsthand. And it is true, unfortunately, that the cost overruns on that project have been enormous. And so a lot of people look at that and say, you can't do it. I have a different takeaway from it. I would say that as to maybe just take one step back. You say your question was, what are the implications of Kemper for my assertion that CCS is an indispensable technology to decarbonization? And I say there are none, in the sense that my conclusion that you need CCS doesn't proceed from the feasibility of Kemper. It starts with the basic question of, do I think that it's reasonable to hope that the world is going to stop burning fossil fuels? And the answer is no, they're not.
To clarify, what we've seen so far with Kemper would suggest that it's not economically feasible.
With today's technologies right now in that project, yes, it is not economically competitive. And so my point on CCS is that if you take the decarbonization challenge seriously, you can't get there without figuring out a way to make CCS work. Otherwise, China and India, their coal emissions are going to swamp any possible emissions reductions in this country. And so when I look at Kemper, when I look at CCS generally, I see a technology that I think is clearly feasible. It works. We have a lot of experience with all the different components of it. It needs a lot of development and demonstration and refinement of the technology. And so the Kemper project, I think, highlights that. It's the first project of that sort ever built in this country, and it's still a cutting-edge project in the global context. And so it's not surprising at all that we have challenges associated with that. And the way you bring those costs down over time is that you have to have those projects built and gain experience with them. And so the reason that Jeff and I work together on this EOR initiative is because EOR could potentially make it economical to put CCS on as much as 100 gigawatts of coal plants in this country.
Which Kemper is relying on, right? It's also using the...
It will, yes, it will. Although what we support would be a federal tax credit that would make it more economical and would allow that to be built in other places. And so the point is, if you built 100 gigawatts of CCS in this country, then the costs of the technology would be significantly different than what they are now. The cost overruns with with the Kemper facility are not inherent in the technology. To my understanding, they're very much rooted in the fact that Southern Company hadn't managed a project of that sort before, certainly not in decades. And so all of a sudden, when you have thousands and thousands of workers building this incredibly complicated plant, they have a hard time managing simply the flow of people and material onto that plant. And that's exactly the kind of stuff where when you have experience with that, the costs come down over time.
The only thing I would add to that, I think you're right that it is to be expected to have cost overruns. It's not because the technologies haven't been used before, right? The gasification has been done before. The capture has been done before. The compression and the transport and the injection, it's been done before. It's been done for years and even decades. The issue is it hasn't been done altogether. And sometimes when you look at the components of a technology, and those exist and are known and optimized to a degree, but you haven't integrated them. It is the integration step, which seems like it should be the simplest and, just kind of the icing on the cake. Oftentimes, that's the hardest. So that's why you have cost overruns, and, it's just part of the innovation process.
Sorry, Carmen, go ahead. You have the mic, and then Dave Garb.
Clara Smith from the Council on Competitiveness. It's great to be part of this discussion. I will start by discussing a little bit about the fuel mix issue. So I think the Department of Energy would at least agree that renewable fuels, technologies, et cetera, are not yet cost competitive because they have the Sunshot Initiative. And if they thought that we'd reached their goal, I think we'd hear about it and they'd claim success and move on. So I think they'd agree they're not there, but they are working towards it. Office of Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy, ARPA-E, all of them, they're trying. And like everything else, it takes some time and development and research. I personally think that the nuclear energy issue is more based around the waste. Technologies will catch up once they have something to do with the fuels, but until they figure that one out, I feel like that one's just not quite dead on arrival, but at least stalled in the water. And I'm actually quite surprised to hear you, Sam, talking about the goal of zero emissions, zero CO2 emissions from all of these fuels being the goal, and yet arguing in favor of CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. I personally feel that if we were to turn CO2 into a decent feedstock of something like methane is for pharmaceuticals, then we'll have a good argument in turning it into an economic choice and not just there's something we can use it for. For example, I mean, we could also make the same argument for decaffeinating coffee. Or dry cleaning. CO2 can be used for those things as well, but we don't have enough of a need for all the CO2 being produced by coal plants or anything else. So that's just a thought. Coming from the competitiveness angle, what I want to ask all of you is, none of this is really going to work, in my opinion, in the United States unless there's an economic basis. The two goals, the goal of having reduced carbon emissions, the only two things that have really gotten us there thus far have been shale gas, which has had its own economic implications, was not put in place because of the CO2 implications, and the recession. So my first question to you guys is, well, my only question at this point, when the times are good, are we going to put a policy in place that will have a climate impact that isn't based around these economic implications?
Can I maybe just quickly comment just on the EOR point specifically, and maybe my friends would take up the other aspects of that question. But I would just say the reason I focus on EOR as an opportunity for commercialization of CCS is because you have the opportunity to scale very significantly there, where you could literally put billions of tons of CO2 underground. The Nettle study suggests we could put 18 billion tons of anthropogenic CO2 underground through EOR if we were really to maximize the opportunity there. And I think those numbers actually will only go up in time as we have better technologies and we get into the residual oil zone and so forth. And so
I haven't actually read the Nettle report, but my assumption is you're getting more oil out that would increase the...
You are. And the question of the CO2 balance between the emissions from the oil and CO2 that you put underground is actually an analytically fairly complicated question that we've spent a lot of time looking at. Bottom line, I think it's very clear that it is net negative emissions. You put more CO2 underground with the EOR process than you would get from the oil, but I wouldn't say it's an enormous.
I find that hard to believe, but I won't disagree because I haven't read the report.
Yeah, believe me, that's not covered in the Nettle report, but believe me, we've spent a lot of time looking very closely at that. I can talk to you about that offline. I won't say that the net is enormously significant. The advantage of doing it this way is that, as I said a couple times already, it is a way of paying for the commercialization of CCS on as much as 100 gigawatts of the U.S. coal fleet. And that, to me, is an important end in and of itself. It is advancing the innovation process on the technology, so at the end of it, maybe we aren't building Kemper plants that cost $5 billion. We've got technologies that actually work and are ready to be deployed into global markets. That's the point, is you want to drive the innovation process.
How much of a net then? How much do you actually?
It's a very complicated question.
Then what's the point of
the point of it?
The point of CCS is to decarbonize coal.
The point of it. The point of it is that I'm trying to drive the innovation process, so that at the end of building out 100 gigawatts of CCS on the coal plants, we've got a highly refined CCS technology that is ready to be deployed into global markets. So we're not building Kemper plants. We're building a technology that works. Whether the other part of the equation, the reason why this is analytically complicated is the question is, for instance, is the oil that's coming out of the ground through EOR, is that new oil, additional oil that adds to the global emissions, or is it simply displacing oil that we would otherwise import from other countries? And so if it's simply displacing imported oil, then the net carbon emissions actually don't really change much at all. So, the point is, I would say the focus should not be on the tonnage of emissions. It should be on commercializing CCS and making it a viable technology. I'm trying to build out the toolkit that we have to work on the decarbonization challenge, not simply count annual tonnage, because I think the tonnage count isn't really what the game is about.
Vaughan, did you, or Jeff, did you have anything on the other, not necessarily on the CCS, but on the other
The economic.
part of Clara's question? Right.
Section 3, subsection 2.
The only thing I would say on the economics is I think it's a good question to address the counterfactual where we're not in a recession, and when we're not in a recession and we're growing quickly, there's a big push not to touch anything at all because it's going so well. Yeah. So I think it's good to address, to recognize that and kind of come to your own conclusions about whether you're hearing whether you're hearing rhetoric kind of turn on a dime, or whether you're hearing something substantial. Because the rhetoric will turn quicker than than you can. So we can't do it because we're in a recession. Becomes we can't do it because we don't want to touch anything.
I guess that's the question, right? If you're talking to an industry leader who is ostensibly emitting much more CO2 than the next guy, right, with his plans and such, when do you think it might actually be a situation where they say, instead of investing in a new manufacturing line or 10 jobs for computer scientists who will make me better products, I'm going to invest in reducing my CO2 emissions? Mm-hmm. When do you think that might actually happen, at least here in the U.S.? Mm-hmm. I don't know that it's coming anytime soon.
And from a policy standpoint, when do you invest the marginal dollar in reductions in a country which on a global scale will have small impact versus investing that marginal dollar someplace else? I mean, that becomes exactly one of the questions.
And as far as I understand from China, their point of view is, well, you guys have better technology than we do, so why don't you just give it to us? And the American companies say, you actually have to pay for that. And they say, well, screw it, we'll emit pollutants then.
Or different. So where their focus is going to be necessarily, and Sam alluded to some of this, is going to be on the health, the direct health impacts of pollution. They've got tremendous tropospheric ozone problems. They've got tremendous sulfuric acid problems. And those, there are technologies, there are policies, there are other things that are if not, they're well established and can have more immediate impact. And if you look at the history of the Clean Air Act, I mean, that preceded even the whole focus on climate change by now 30 years. And so if you're now looking at the lag time to where the political, I'm not saying, so whether or not the technological, the political change is going to be focused in many ways necessarily on things like mercury, on things like sulfuric and sulfate and SO2 and NOx and SOx and some other things and particulates. Now, that's going to be probably, there might be some co-benefit in that, but there also are policies that you'll take to reduce those that actually will lead to a net increase in your CO2 emissions.
And I would just add the Chinese are very interested in EOR and other carbon utilization opportunities, enhanced water recovery, other enhanced fossil fuels, for their own reasons aside from the carbon benefits.
Vaughan, you were at the very end there talking about the possibility of China's CO2 emissions actually going up, and that's something that you and I have talked about under a case where China is trying to reduce its air pollution. Maybe you could amplify that a little bit for everybody, because I think that's counterintuitive.
Well, it's two questions, right? So one part is one of the reasons why we saw some cooling during periods in the 20th century has to do with sulfate aerosol, right? So the sulfate aerosol actually is depending on where it is and what it's doing, and that's for it actually reflects. So if you actually do take big policies to reduce your sulfuric acid, which is something that will probably continue to go forward in China, you will actually have a net impact of actually changing some of the temperature in a positive direction. It's sort of the radiative physics on that. The second piece of it, which Paul's alluding to.
So if I can put it into non-scientific.
No, please. I'm going to wait till you see the equations.
By taking sulfuric acid out of what you emit from your plants, you're taking sulfates out of the air, and by taking sulfates out of the air, you are actually reflecting less heat and allowing that instead to come down to the ground, so that you're
Not
actually
heat, radiation.
So you're actually contributing to warming by cleaning up your coal plants.
Potentially. I mean, now then the question is the question of the offset on what you're doing with carbon particles too. But the question that so the cleaning up though actually requires an increased use of energy, and so then you start getting into it's not a huge increase, as it turns out, because there are fairly efficient ways to do it, and they become more efficient. But it's not trivial when you're looking at scale. I mean, you start multiplying these numbers out, and it starts increasing CO2 emissions slightly.
David Garman, and then Myron and Jeff.
Thank you. I'm concerned that we're in danger of losing diversity in our baseload generation fleet, and to me, Kemper is proof of the fact that taking new technology and taking it up to commercial scale is very expensive and it's very difficult. And I think that was also proven in Duke Energy's build of the Edwardsport IGCC plant.
Yes.
And if we hope to take new nuclear or new zero-emission fossil plants to scale, we need some kind of help to bridge the valley of death, because Duke and Southern are about the only utilities with a balance sheet that can try to do something like this. And elsewhere in the utility industry, there just isn't much of a stomach for it, and I fear that the Kemper experience may take what stomach for it that there was away. And there's not much appetite in industry, more generically, to do much scaling of new technology. And I can say that I chair the Electric Power Research Institute Advisory Council, and frankly, the money they spend is mainly oriented toward keeping the existing nuclear plants going another 20 or 30 years. They're not really doing a whole lot of what I would say new technology or scaling new technology. And it's my observation, at least from experience in government, that government does a fairly lousy job of new demonstration or scaling technology to commercial scale. I don't think they've really done a good job of it since scaling the plutonium production reactors in the Manhattan Project. So who should do this? If the private sector isn't inclined to scale new technology, and the government isn't equipped to scale new technology, we really lack an institutional framework to accomplish what I think, Sam, I think you hit it out of the park. This challenge that we really need to tackle. Who will do this?
What's the answer?
I mean, obviously, David and I work together a lot, and so he knows.
I was hoping you could answer it.
I was about to say, so he knows I don't have any perfect answers on this. I guess one of the points I would make is that I think the answers to that depend a lot on the nature of the specific technology you're looking at, and that simple kind of across-the-board multi-technology solutions, which my conservative friends like in theory. They like the idea of market mechanisms, a simple tax credit, for instance, that is technology neutral or something like that. I personally don't think that is what is needed. I think that there are different challenges in different areas. So, as you know, David, I think if you're thinking about CCS, I think that there should be that the federal government, if they would provide a temporary declining tax credit that was appropriately structured to incentivize CCS in different technology sectors, which is what the NEORI recommendations provide. I think that's a way that the government can help bring.
Might even be revenue positive.
Might even be significantly revenue positive. I think that would be a way for the government policy to help commercialize CCS. But if I look at the nuclear space, as you know, I don't think the question is simply just a clean energy tax credit or something like that. I would look much more to, regulatory measures such as how do we give the Nuclear Regulatory Commission the mission and capability of licensing advanced reactors, and that is a relatively small dollar move, but it could have a significant effect. I think, as David and I have written about together, I think reforming the Department of Energy structure itself and the national labs so that they could more effectively contribute to that process would also be a very big innovation bang for the buck. And so, one of the ideas we've talked about is whether we could have a test bed for advanced nuclear reactors operated on a DOE or DOD site, which would free them from the NRC oversight and allow companies that have these innovative designs to come in and actually demonstrate them, and have the NRC maybe sitting there looking over their shoulder, learning something from that process so that you could accelerate the licensing process. So I think you got to look at different technologies and the specific barriers to those technologies to think about what the appropriate responses would be. Maybe Jeff?
No, that's great.
Jeff, Vaughan, anything? No? All right. Myron, please. Myron Ebel.
I'm a little scared of these, so I'll just talk loud. Myron Ebel, Competitive Enterprise Institute. I have several questions. I think this has been very informative, but I think that certain things that are left out of the discussion. The first is, Vaughan, you said that it's unlikely that the pressure is off the administration. It seems to me that they want to sign an agreement in 2015 or 2016 because, of course, they won't have to implement it or get it ratified, or it could just be an executive agreement. What's really happened internationally is that the team is a lot smaller. Australia's off, Canada's off, India's off, Japan's off, and China wants an agreement but doesn't want to undertake commitments, and the G77 support China in that, and China supports the G77 in this wealth transfer. So the team is a lot smaller that's pushing for an international agreement. The second point, in following up what Clara Smith said, Sam, we've had a major innovation in the energy industry, and it's called combining horizontal drilling, hydraulic fracturing, and smart drilling technology, and the federal involvement in that was pretty close to zero. Yes.
No.
Look, there's a guy in Texas named George Mitchell who spent about 15 years poking around trying to do it, spending his own money, and he finally figured it out. And
George Mitchell is the first to admit how important the Eastern Shales Project and the DOE program was.
Look, nobody thought he
He
could do
quoted it.
He hit it with
He
a shovel.
said it.
Yeah, but nobody. Let's
You're
leave
arguing
that
with
aside.
George Mitchell.
Why don't we let Myron continue, and we can come back to that.
So the 17% below 2005 goal is actually quite reachable because of continuing economic stagnation and this revolution. And so I would just ask Jeff's comments on this proposition. There has not been any statistically significant warming or increase in the global mean temperature for the past 17 years and counting. All the 105 model runs that the IPCC has done or used predict significant warming in that period, except for 2. So we've got over a 98% agreement of the models that we should have had significant warming, which we have not had. Now, there are many reasons put forward now by people like Michael Mann about why we've got this 17-year and 10-month lack of warming. But the most obvious one is that the models are tuned too high. The climate is less sensitive to CO2 than the scientific establishment has assumed, as some very great scientists have said all along. I mean, Dick Lindzen said this in 1988-89. The models are tuned too high. So it seems to me we might just declare victory on this. And finally, to Sam, the legal liabilities of CCS are the real problem. It's not a lack of tax credits. It's not a lack of research. It's not a lack of investment, or that the technology doesn't work. We can't even build a pipeline in this country now. How are we going to build thousands of miles of pipelines without the environmentalists litigating them to death? It'll take 20 years to get a permit. And then you store it underground, and you're supposed to provide legal liability that it will be there safely for 1,000 years. It seems to me that this is just completely impossible, given our current environment with the environmental groups. I mean, they might change their mind, but that's going to be a big push to get them to change their mind.
Yeah, just quickly on that point, I certainly agree that the liability issue is significant, but I would strongly disagree that it is insurmountable. It is certainly possible to put carbon dioxide underground and keep it there safely, essentially indefinitely. The fact that the EOR market that we have in this country today is based not on anthropogenic CO2, but on geologic CO2. It's mined CO2. And that CO2 has been there for thousands and thousands of years. It's a very clear demonstration that there are places in this country where it is geologically feasible to put CO2 underground and it will stay there essentially forever. And so I do believe that Congress needs to legislate around an EOR program, and that part of that legislation has to address the liability issues and some of the other associated issues, EPA's guidance on Class 6 wells and things like that. I think Congress needs to take that up, but I think there's no reason why it couldn't do so effectively.
Okay, so can I actually ask a question? Because I don't know the answer to this one, like many things. Whether the Yankees are going to win the World Series.
No.
Come back in a year. We'll see. For pollutants, CO2 is a pollutant. How does that affect, legally, the ability to put it underground? If it is indeed counted as a pollutant. It affects things like ocean. So the London Protocol has clear implication. It has clear implications for ocean sequestration. But if it is indeed a pollutant, it changes the nature of what can go underground.
It does. And so this is one of these complicated issues now I alluded to in my answer to Myron just now, where right now, when we use CO2 in EOR, it's not considered to be a pollutant. It is considered to be part of an industrial process, and so the regulations of that are pretty light-handed. But that if it is being treated as a sequestration of a hazardous air pollutant, essentially, then it's true that right now, the way EPA is looking at it, the regulatory burdens that would come with that are potentially very onerous, and there's a lot of concern that this, in fact, could pull the rug out from underneath the existing EOR industry industry in this country today. And, I think the answer to that is on a common sense basis, there are safe and effective ways to handle CO2 and to regulate the storage of it and the monitoring and verification requirements. And I think that all has to be taken up by Congress as part of legislation. I don't think the current laws and regulations governing that space are effective to address the situation that we have. And a lot of the problems that we have is that Congress is not legislating on carbon. Maybe Jeff has some thoughts. I think you probably
I was going to say, I know absolutely nothing about this issue at all. I'm not a lawyer or anything else, but let me just make what seems to me to be a common sense observation. If you're storing a hazardous pollutant and a small amount of it leaks out, it could potentially be immediately dangerous to people who live in the area and cause both harm and substantial immediate liability. If you have a gazillion tons of CO2 underground and there's a slow leak,
Right.
it strikes me that that's kind of a somewhat different issue in terms of its impact, and I would think there would be ways in regulation to manage something like that. But I don't know, Jeff, maybe you have...
No, I think you're really talking about the same thing. You talk about the liability of CO2, and you talk about, what can you do in terms of disposing of hazardous substances underground. It's really the same thing, and I would agree that, we need to do more on clarifying where you kind of thread that one in terms of protecting people and allowing the technology to go forward as quickly as possible.
Build a bottling plant there, sorry.
But is CO2, yeah, right, a lot of area. Is CO2 considered a pollutant only in the atmosphere? And when it changes to being subsurface, is it considered a pollutant according to the EPA regulations?
Yeah, what EPA has guidance out on now would treat it as a pollutant. And
Even subsurface?
Subsurface. No, subsurface.
Subsurface?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, and so that's the challenge, is that companies that are in the EOR business now and are used to handling carbon dioxide not as a pollutant, but as an industrial process, are concerned that EPA regulations could make their current business model difficult. And so that is one of the areas where I think there needs to be some legislation to address that.
It's Yucca Mountain times 1,000.
Yeah, except the difference is that it's not radioactive waste, Myron, and that makes a big damn difference. So,
All right. Let's move on.
Apologies for my...
Let's move on. Let's move on. Jeff Kemp, you had a question.
Jeffrey Kemp here from the Centre. It comes back to the question that was raised right at the end of the table by the lady I cannot see or do not know, and it concerns nuclear waste and where we're actually at in dealing with this horrendous problem, which seems to be a huge constraint on further nuclear power plants in this country, even if the technology is getting better. So I'd like just sort of a readout on where we stand on this issue from someone on the panel. And the second point has to do with if indeed that issue is resolved and there are these great new designs that Sam talked about, to what extent do issues such as rising sea levels affect the expected costs of building new nuclear power stations? I know every Navy brief I go to these days, all they talk about is the impact of rising sea levels on naval bases around this country, and I assume if nuclear power plants are to be located near water that's not fresh and valuable, then the seacoast becomes an important place to put them, and therefore the costs would go up.
So I don't have great answers for you, Jeff, but I'll take a quick pass at that. On the waste question, I really think this is basically a political challenge. It doesn't have anything to do with the inherent, economics of nuclear or anything about the future of nuclear and innovation. This has everything. I think it has everything to do with Harry Reid and our inability to come to some political consensus around this, and that a solution to that political gridlock will be found, whether it's this year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now, whether it requires that Harry Reid retire and maybe a California senator or two as well. I don't know. But I don't think it is an inherently insurmountable problem. I think Yucca is a fine location to at least store waste on a current basis, but there are also other, geologically ideal sites in North America that could serve perfectly well. My point on innovation, though, is that I don't think that a lack, and I'm sorry I didn't address this when you raised the question originally, I don't think a lack of a solution to the waste problem needs to be an obstacle to innovation in the nuclear space. I think it may, as a practical political matter, be serving as that barrier now, but I don't think there's any inherent reason why it should be. If you don't like the amount of nuclear waste we have in this country now and the amount we were producing, one of the first things we ought to care about is building nuclear reactors that produce a lot less waste. And that is an opportunity that is right there before us, so that we could be, operating reactors that are highly efficient and burn most of the fuel rather than leaving most of the fuel as waste. And so obviously different reactors have different characteristics there. Some of these reactor designs out there actually would burn up the waste that we have now, although I'm a little bit skeptical we would build enough of them to actually, consume a significant fraction of the stockpile of waste. So I don't see that as a solution. But the point is, we could at least stop. Okay? We could at least stop. I'm not quite sure I follow the connection there. Let me just finish the sentence. We could at least stop adding to the problem as much as we are now by building new reactors that are much better in terms of the waste, rather than just keep going with the status quo. Maybe others have...
Thank you very much, Sam. Anybody? No. Well, let me ask maybe a final question, and then we'll wrap up. There is one technology solution to this problem that didn't come up, and I know, Sam, that it's something that you've worked on in the past, and I feel sort of obliged to throw it out there, which is geoengineering.
Sure.
And I'd be interested in reactions from all three of you. We've talked, Vaughan and I, about this in the past, too.
I mean, I'm not quite sure exactly what you want me to say about geoengineering, but...
Do you see, it's something that people talk about, do you see any viable pathway forward that includes that?
So, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, geoengineering is a broad term to cover all technologies that involve the sort of intentional manipulation of the global environment in some ways that would counteract the effects of global warming. And so perhaps the best known example of that would be, in essence, building artificial volcanoes that put stratospheric particles of some sort in the stratosphere to block a certain amount of the incoming sunlight, and thus balance out the effects of the elevated CO2 in the atmosphere. And, I guess what I would say about geoengineering is that I do think that it is difficult to imagine a mitigation and adaptation only set of policies that would fully manage the range of climate risks that are out there. So we could work as hard as we want on reducing emissions, and we can work as hard as we can on adapting to emissions. And Myron may, be right in saying that climate sensitivity is much lower than we think it is. I think it's not as likely as Myron does, but it's possible he's right. What I don't hear you say, Myron, is that it's also possible that sensitivity is much higher than we think it is. And if it's much higher, we're going to be in a world of hurt no matter what we do on adaptation or emissions reductions. And so in those sorts of scenarios, you really would need to have a geoengineering option out there. And I think the key thing that, from a policy point of view, that people should be thinking about is the fact that geoengineering would be an extremely challenging thing to do. I think on a basic conceptual technical level, it would not be that hard. We know it can be done. We have the example of Mount Pinatubo, for instance, which cooled the planet for about a year and a half by about the degree of that would be necessary to counteract the warming that we're experiencing. And so on a broad conceptual level, we know this can be done, but in terms of the actual engineering of a system to do it, I think it would be extremely challenging. It would take probably a minimum of 50 years. And so what we should be working on is a federally funded R&D program, even on a very modest level, that would give us some understanding of how to do that. And 4 or 5 years ago, when I was working on this issue a lot more, I thought I was pretty optimistic that we were going to have that kind of program. There was a moment there in 2010, 2011, when we had a number of key reports about geoengineering coming out. The Royal Society in England, the Bipartisan Policy Center, where I worked briefly, the GAO, Bart Gordon in Congress, the National Academies, all had reports coming out in the space of about a year and a half or two saying it's very important that we have geoengineering research programs getting underway. And then that moment kind of slipped away, and frankly, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that the Obama administration wasn't willing to touch it because they felt it was a distraction from their agenda around Copenhagen and Waxman-Markey. And so the momentum towards a federal geoengineering research program has been kind of lost, and I hope it will be recovered.
I'll just add one thing. I think that it's interesting you say it's an engineering problem. I would actually say that the engineering is probably further ahead than the science on this, because we do know what it can do to temperature, but the secondary impacts, which are always the difficulty in any type of a climate modeling system, are very difficult. You don't know the ecological impacts of dulling or dimming the solar radiation. The other thing it doesn't address is probably right now the one most direct impact of the current CO2 emissions is the impact on the acidification of near coast waters. It's a CO2 buildup, and so you're not doing anything with the CO2, and then the question becomes, are you actually looking at different models, one which is actually the vacuum cleaner that Klaus Lochner looks at of actually withdrawing CO2 into which would have other impacts. So I actually think it's a science problem. The other major challenge, and the reason why it's probably worth talking about, is there are huge international implications, because at some point it is actually much easier to do this unilaterally or with a group of like-mindeds and have big impacts, and you could see the differences in the way who determines the temperature dial to, because you can dial it.
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
Binding agreement on that.
That's right. Yeah.
I expect that's unlikely, Jeff. No. Judging by the conflict in my own household over the thermostat, and there are only 5 of us, not 193, I have a vivid imagination about where that would go. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I think it was a very broad-ranging and also deep conversation, and we appreciate your coming out on a Friday for it. So please join me thanking our speakers.